Continuation of the Small City Talk series, Abohar Urban Studio brings you Shehar Conversation in collaboration with Studio Oriole and Municipal Corporation Abohar. Shehar Conversation is a step to explore the different facets of life in small town of India. The speakers will cover aspects of urban growth, physical and cultural transformation of small cities, the aspiration of the youth, governance aspects, and issues of social segregation of different communities in the city. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our fifth speaker, Dr. Rohit Negi. Dr. Rohit Negi is presently an associate professor in the School of Global Affairs and director of Center for Community Knowledge in Ambedkar University, Delhi. After completing an undergraduate degree from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, Rohit moved to the US for first an MA in urban planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and then PhD in geography at the Ohio State University. Rohit's interests hinge around the intersection of capitalism, social change, and nature, approached from multiple vantage points, but with the focus on sub-Saharan Africa and India. His master's research was on environmental politics in Delhi and PhD on the geographies of mineral extraction in the Zambian copper belt. Rohit is currently engaged in research on urban political ecology in Delhi and on development and social change in Himachal. His work has appeared in publications like Journal of Southern African Studies, GeoForum, Review of African Political Economy, and African Geographical Review. So today, Dr. Rohit will present a talk on situating the Himalayan urban turn, time of building in Bharmour, Himachal Pradesh. We all are very excited to hear Dr. Rohit. So now I'll invite Dr. Negi to take over from here.
Thanks so much, Sajal, for that intro, quite a long intro. I think you might have taken it from somewhere from which was a while ago. I'm no longer, I mean, it's been such a long time that I've sort of been able to get back to African studies in Africa that it's been, I no longer sort of consider myself specialist in that. But in any case, it's wonderful to join all of you to know about the work that you all have been doing in Abohar, and look forward to hearing about that work more, I think, in the coming few days when you present. So I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint. Just let me know when you are able to. We'll also make it full screen.
It's visible to us.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, so basically just to give you a little bit of a background, I have been very interested in the process of social change in the region, in the Western Himalaya, specifically more specifically focusing on Himachal Pradesh, and understanding social change through place, through geographies, through the investments that people are making in places, and that has led me to these settlements like Bharmour, which which may or may not be categorized officially as towns, but which sort of are becoming one. So there is a process of becoming that is quite clear, and they are changing very fast as well. And this is kind of this image you can see in the background, that is Bharmour, and it would be obviously very different. It is very different from what it would be just even a couple of decades ago, right? So the pace of change is quite fast. Now, this project is also quite close to my heart. I mean, in the sense that, one tries to keep on working with this even when there is no funding. So it's not tied to any specific funds or any specific project. It just, whenever there is time, there is some space, we sort of, with colleagues, with former students, we managed to put some more pieces of the puzzle together and somehow build while also taking time with it. So, so I have a paper here. I'll read a little bit, but I'll also just try to explain as we go along so that it's somewhat more interactive as well. But today, actually, I will start with the story of four brothers from this from the agri-pastoral Gaddi community in their 30s and 40s that who live here in Bharmour, in Chamba district of Himachal Pradesh. So their father had inherited an old house in the village that she took down in the early 1970s to build a new wooden house using the same material, but with more rooms and few more rooms and newer elements like taller and wider doorways. So the house was divided amongst the brothers in 2007 after the father's demise, with each inheriting a room in the house. As they got married and had children, as the families expanded, the accommodation obviously became cramped. So a few years later, 3 of the 4 pooled money to build a new 3-floor concrete structure adjacent to the old house. One of them, Vijay, had fallen upon tough times, and his family continued to occupy their room in the older house. It took them 6 more years to finally construct their own floor above the brothers' structure, which now comprised of 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bathroom, and with visibly poorer finishing and less expensive materials than the other units. So when we met them in late 2017, Sanjay, a second brother who runs a shop in Bharmour, and Praveen, third one, a contractor with several government construction projects, told us about their plans to build a hotel nearby for the visitors who pass through Bharmour during the annual Mani Mahesh Yatra or pilgrimage to Lord Shiva's abode in Dauladar range close by. Sandeep, the fourth brother, an engineer in a parastatal living with his family in Haryana, wants to build, we were told, a larger independent house. So Vijay's floor in the new house, however, turned out at the same level as the older accommodation. This allowed him to merge the 2 walls and create a new connection, direct connection between the 2 units. So showing this connected doorway to us with pride, Vijay claimed, I alone have this privilege. So scholars like Jonathan Rigg have invited researchers to turn attention to the increased decoupling of rural poverty and well-being from agriculture and other, supposedly traditional livelihoods, and to the more move to, as we've seen, people move to highly mobile and delocalized lives and livelihoods across the global south. These shifts are not accidental by any means and draw on the work of development policy as well as capitalism. In this context, the Indian state of HP has been hailed by many. Education is nearly universal in Himachal. Public healthcare, at least the primary level healthcare, is widely accessible. And poverty also has declined sharply to 1/3 of the national average. So while there is undeniable, though uneven, social mobility across the region, I have been interested, like I said earlier, in its spatiality, in where it is fixed, and also with this paper in its temporality, as to how does it reconfigure notions of time, and how does time also configure life in these places. These questions follow from the transposition of what Gyan Prakash had termed the urban turn in critical inquiry more lately, from metropolitan cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, etc., to ordinary and relatively off-the-map settlements like Bharmour here, or even Abohar, you could argue. So lately, interest in India's non-metros has flourished, spanning the urban peripheries, Mufassal towns, census towns, and more generally, what Mukhopadhyay, etc., et al. Call subaltern urbanization, which they describe as, I quote, vibrant smaller settlements, spaces outside the metropolitan shadow, sustainably supporting a dispersed pattern of urbanization. These settlements often benefit from regional economic growth, drawing on activities like construction, paratransit, and services, as they say, around cell phones, private education, private healthcare. As such, it is seen across contexts then that individuals and families increasingly view their future in part as urban, no matter where their lives unfold. A strong interweaving of the rural, especially the historical agrarian relations with the emergent urban processes is also observed. Some have been calling it agrarian urbanization. Alongside the conceptual reworkings of the urban, which have just very briefly charted out, there has also been an interest in spatiality of change in the Himalayas, with insightful work on built environments and infrastructures, including by Anu here, on metabolic flows, that is questions of waste, sanitation, for instance, on environmental aspects of change, that is water, etc. The rapid changes in our place of interest here, Bharmour, as well as its concretization, are also aspects that have been observed across the Himalayan region, which provides a culturally unique but environmentally fragile context to the urban process. So the ethnographic sort of vignette that I opened with the brothers maps the conceptual contours of critical research agenda on urbanizing Himalaya. It speaks of uneven economic mobility, of material reconfigurations, of new emergent temporalities, but also divergent notions of futures or futurities. So each of the four brothers is economically better off than the father, as we see, who served as a soldier first in the army and then as a guard in the local bank after retirement. Despite the hardships, the parents managed to educate all the children to ensure some kind of a generational mobility. At the same time, its unevenness is observed from the trajectory of one of the brothers, Vijay, whose investments in business ventures have failed repeatedly until he found employment as a forest guard in 2016 using political contacts. So speaking broadly, the increased surplus in the hands of many in the region finds its way into the town, leading to the settlement's material reconfiguration, as I just mentioned. And as you can see here on the slide as well, you have this mixing in of old and new, of concrete as well as wood. And finally, having begun their life stories in the same home, the four brothers are architects of and participants in different futurities, different aspirations, as well as trajectories. Sandeep sees Bharmour as a summer home after retirement from his government posting. Praveen and Sanjay see it as a bundle of economic opportunities. As they said, they plan to construct a new hotel, while Vijay is right now content with the relative stability in his life that the new job brings. So by attending to social spatial change through the element of time, this paper then aims to understand small town through this rather less studied framework, especially with respect to smaller towns. At the macro scale, the scale that sort of sets the horizons of possibilities, we find the entanglement of what I've been calling the historical mythological time, the developmental time, and capitalist time. These temporalities sometimes overlap neatly, but there are often disturbances and interferences between them. At the micro scale, I focus on the different times of building in Bharmour, which is sort of where the subtitle to today's talk comes from. That is building as seasonal, progressive, or sporadic process, which produces a diverse built environment and different experiences of inhabiting and dwelling in the town. I will very briefly, and I'll describe all these and then briefly today and with some ideas about the future as people perceive it and articulate it. In part, it's seen as an external force to be reckoned with, and in part as an aspiration that informs resident decisions and actions in the present. The work sort of draws on 6 months of fieldwork in Bharmour between 2017 and 18. I have been visiting from before that, but this is when the real fieldwork took place, and we use predominantly 3 kinds of methodologies. In the interest of time, I'll just move on right now, but leave it here for a second, and we can discuss more if there are questions about anything particular after the talk. So situated at an altitude of around 7,000 feet, Bharmour is the homeland, quote unquote, homeland of the Gaddi community, which, you know, they are quite well known beyond the borders of Himachal as well. There is among pastoralist studies, scholars who are in that tradition, they know about the Gaddi through some very interesting and popular monographs. So the urbanizing village, or the town, as you want, if you want to call it that, of Bharmour is clustered around the 7th century temple complex called the 84 temple, or simply Chaurasi. The Gaddan, that is the homeland, is spiritually adorned and widely known as the abode of Lord Shiva, and the Gaddi are supposedly his chosen people. As one scholar notes, in the region, the divine is landscaped, and the landscape is made divine. The Gaddi agripastoral society operates with a seasonality such that the summers are spent in the upper reaches of the Himalaya, the winters in the plains to the south beyond the Dhauladhar, and the intervening periods of spring and autumn at home in Bharmour. While this transhumance is predominantly male enterprise, entire families, though, tended to move to the plains in the harsh winters when the place would be practically isolated from the rest of the state. But some qualifications are needed here, though, because there is a widespread association of the region with this kind of a reified Gaddi way of life, and with, therefore, transhuman pastoralism. First, there are groups other than the Gaddi who never practice pastoralism. And there is caste at play here that Johnson in his PhD thesis has written about. Second, even the Gaddi, as Richard Axelby says, have never been pure nomads, but rather combined pastoralism with farming and other activities. And third, because more recently, even most pastoralist families have moved entirely to other occupations. And this process has brought many to Bharmour. Already by 2005, historian O.C. Honda could write the following. He said, spilled over, it's beyond its seams with high-rising concrete buildings popping up everywhere. Bharmour of today, he says, is a humming little town. The process is only accelerated since then. So we sort of created these two maps. One of them is on your screens, basically, which mapped the activity, that is housing, commercial and institutional uses in Bharmour. And basically, you can see how from the highway leading up to the Chaurasi temple complex, there is a string of commercial activity. So this is like the commercial spine of the settlement, with many shops and hotels now, and dhabas and restaurants, to cater primarily to those who visit the temple complex. It's a 7th century temple complex. And there has been widespread sort of boom in construction of housing as well. There is also a helipad, which is partly because this place used to be isolated during the snow, but also partly because VIPs want to take the chopper to Mani Mahesh, both of those reasons. This is sort of the materials that have been used in housing. So this is only the housing units. And you can see that there are only 26 out of, how many are there? Some over 200 buildings that are older structures. There are some that are purely concrete, new constructions, but there are also very interesting mix in Bharmour, where people like those, that family that I mentioned earlier, that I opened with, who have built the new construction right next and sort of interwoven into the older one. So the built environment reveals, so we found some over 400 buildings already in 2018, and each with several families living in, several nuclear families living in them. And which leads to the conclusion that there are far many more people in this settlement than the census population of 1075 would reveal. And that is something common that one observes, at least in Himachal Pradesh, because people want to retain their rural enlistment for various things, including Manrega. Then there are different typologies of construction that you can see. You have these kinds of larger construction, the one you can see at the back behind the dish antenna, where you have this kind of modular construction, presumably for renting out by sets, by rooms, and for commercial purposes, I mean, renting out. And these are the kinds of construction also mostly for self-use. On the left, you can see the what I mentioned earlier with the old and the new sort of just completely coming together here. And of course, many commercial buildings for as shops, as go downs, as stores, and so on. And because of the expansion of construction, as I've just mapped, there are also many shops that cater to the construction process itself. So the supposed backwardness and isolation, however, of the Gaddi has contributed to the region being a notified tribal area, and therefore the beneficiary of constitutional provisions like reservations in education and employment, legal protections like the outlawing of purchase of land by non-locals, infrastructure development, state grants. These provisions, as many scholars have argued, have further accelerated the process of what is known in sort of pastoral literature as sedentarization of pastoralists. That is, people sort of permanently moving away from transhumant. With relatively high literacy rates, access to government jobs, and a thriving and a more recent thriving horticultural economy centered on apple cultivation. So scholars of the Gaddi have recently called for attention to other aspects of life, including diasporic experiences and what Christopher calls the post-pastoral enactments of place, which is, I believe, is very apt for framing of an agenda for which urbanizing Bharmour is an ideal ground. So urban life, however, is composed of a multiplicity of intersecting temporalities. So some activities, government offices, for example, operate usually within regimented time, while others like online food delivery services, and at least in the larger cities, cannot be predicted and evolve real time. While most livelihoods are earned during daytime, others are nocturnal. Spaces also change in use, character, and meaning depending on time. Footpaths in places like Old Delhi that are used not only to walk, but also for street vending during the day become sites of sleep and resting for migrant workers and those going through homelessness at night. We observe it around Ambedkar University, Kashmiri Gate. Time not only shapes the people's lives and possibilities, but itself is also constantly being structured by people, right? So spatio-temporal dynamics are then a productive lens to study the urban, and especially in urbanizing context, where it is in these processes that larger negotiations, contestations play out. So this section that I'm just moving to thinks through this idea by considering time in Bharmour through the two scales that I mentioned earlier, the macro and the micro. So as far as the macro temporalities are concerned, the region's rhythms are strongly influenced by the pastoralist time that follows seasonality, even if many people are not engaged anymore in pastoralism. This seasonality is tied to environmental dynamics in terms of weather and ecology, since biomass availability in pastures is different across the year. Like most aspects of life and space in this region, these rhythms are also ascribed ritual meaning tied to Lord Shiva's movements. So Shiv makes Mani Mahesh the abode for 6 months of the year before migrating to the lower land in the winters. Thus, as Molly Kaushal says, the nomadic Shiva, patterning the life of his devotees after his own, has regulated the rhythm of Gaddi lifestyle with these two distinct shifts. That is summer months in Bharmour and Lahore and elsewhere, and winters in the foothills. Over the last generation or two, many Gaddi who had rights to pastures in Kangra have permanently settled in places like Nurpur and Dharamshala. Since these areas are seen to provide greater access to education and employment, several others have built a second home, and they maintain a second home in the foothills where they spend the winter months in continuation of the Gaddi seasonal movements. Even though, like I've been repeating, most of them are not following pastoralist livelihoods anymore. In fact, Bharmour's population dwindles as the winters approach and economic activity ceases to a large extent. During the interviews we conducted as the winter was setting in, many families we spoke to were preparing to move to their relatives' homes in Kangra. These There are those, of course, who remain in Bharmour for one or the other reason, but even the rhythms of their lives change dramatically as the winters set in. Mukesh, a 35-year-old from a non-Gaddi scheduled caste, Rehada caste, spends his winters like his family in Bharmour, but he says from the end of December, it will snow for 2 to 3 months. We put together everything, wood, LPG, ration in advance. Then for these months, we live a repetitive life, wake up and take in the sun. There is nothing else to do. No one visits Bharmour. So the historical time then is shaped by the seasonality of pastoralism, is what I've been sort of working with in terms of the first temporality at the macro scale. The second is post-colonial developmental time. The scholars have explored the ideas of linearity, progress, teleology, even in the development discourse, as well as tendency to order hierarchically, as Laura Beer says, order hierarchically, separate and adjudicate between other social times. The notion that certain places are backward, like Bharmour here, in not only in economics literature, but also in popular imagination, but through a series of formulaic interventions can be brought forward to a state of development remains pervasive. Such ideas are, well, informed state projects organized around quote unquote tribal development, which have been well funded since the mid 1970s. An entire paraphernalia of state agencies has come up in Bharmour to implement projects designed to mainstream the supposedly remote and isolated Gaddi tribal group through the priority extension of roads, electricity, education, healthcare, as well as loans towards setting up small businesses. It is another matter, and quite ironic, that, as we have already discussed, the Gaddi are a mobile group who've been materially and culturally connected to societies far beyond Bharmour for centuries. In a manner beautifully explained by Anna Singh, when the exoticization of such groups by outsiders and the state apparatus is accompanied by material resources, locals often interpolated as backward, perform backwardness when needed. We were often told that Bharmour was several decades behind places like Shimla or Delhi in development by young people who were in college, but who were connected with the wider world through the smartphones. Singh also mentions how this desire for development excites agencies of development greatly, and many locals can benefit from positioning themselves as the mediators of outside inside or modernity tradition. Thakur Singh Bharmouri, a local politician who's been, he's held important ministries in the Himachal government for many decades, is one such individual whose life story is tied to the connection of the region with the state machinery. Richard Axelby has a lovely write-up on his own encounters with Bharmouri. If you're interested, you can Google Axelby Bharmouri, and sort of how this person who's a local panchayat functionary in the 70s sort of rises through the ranks and becomes a minister, famous minister. So even as development's project of linearity is indisputable, in Bharmour, it bends around seasonality. So government employees posted in Bharmour receive several months' salary in advance of winter, and locals are provided a few months' ration through the PDS system at once, both with the assumption that the place will remain isolated from the outside once snow sets in. Also, the administrative machinery is reorganized, and it's a single line ministry. Basically, the SDM has way more power during those months than otherwise she or he will. They don't have to go to line ministry for everything in Shimla. The third macro temporality here is then of capitalism. Basically state capitalism, you can call it that, because they always work together, right? There is no capital without state. Including the artifacts that are produced by the ideology of developmental time become the infrastructure that allow the circulation of capital and reconfigure time according to its logics. Time, as you know, is the basic unit of capitalism, the primary unit of value, and the ingredient of exploitation. The essential quality, tendency of capital to save time, whether in production, distribution, or turnover, it produces a dynamic world of technology, logistics, marketing, leading to what Marx termed the annihilation of space by time. Urban areas in capitalism display what Henri Lefebvre wrote about as the fast temporality of simultaneity, and the idea to flatten different times to the time of capital. So certainly state capitalist temporalities are important to the lives of people in Bharmour. If rural roads sought to connect hamlets to the mainstream in the developmental vision, highways now with tunnels drilled under mountain passes look to bypass the vagaries of season altogether. And if you have traveled to places like Kullu, Lahore recently, you would know what I'm talking about. If traveling between Chamba and which is 65 kilometers away, and Bharmour involved knowing the bus timetable and waiting, private vehicles open the possibility of flexible time of travel, bypassing the earlier uncertainty and waiting. And if landline phones meant those in Bharmour could speak with their relatives across the Dhauladhar, now they exchange videos and messages instantly on WhatsApp. But as critical geographers have shown, space too bends time by introducing path dependency, bottlenecks, and defining what is possible and what isn't. There are then heterogeneous, many different forms of duration, pause, obsolescence, and delay that also characterize capital's rhythm, as Hannah Appel et al. Write. The imperative to speed things up, especially through massive infrastructures like tunnels, is often directly connected to the element of risk, especially in the Himalayan region where earthquakes, landslides, and flash floods are common and occurring with increased frequency and intensity with climate change. This year alone, there have been so many accidents which have called attention to this, leading to the questioning of this highwayfication in Himachal. And but more specifically, even capital follows seasonality. The month-long Mani Mahesh Yatra, which I had alluded to earlier, around which pastoralist movements have been timed historically, and which is now a big tourist economy or pilgrimage economy, has come to exert a significant influence over what people want to do and see the future as. And no wonder that the time of Yatra is mentioned as the season, when locals with investments in shops, stalls, and guest houses describe their earnings for the year. So moving to the micro temporalities, to understand the temporalities on the ground and how they are around people's everyday lives, at the scale of everyday lives, consider what can be termed as the time of building, that is of construction, not here of large state or capital-driven infrastructure, but of housing by individuals from different social and economic classes. Having replaced wood and stone construction, concrete is now by far the most visual artifact and symbol of these developments. Size, structural strength, paints, tiling, fixtures are very different depending on particular family savings and access to the skills required to finesse the desired aesthetic. Some buildings are constructed at one go, others take longer, while still others will never reach a state of habitation even after years, leading to different temporalities in the urban process. So in this section, I detailed two main micro-temporalities. So the rhythmic and the choppy here. The smooth one is fairly exceptional, but there are some cases, so I won't spend too much time on that. Each of these is tied to locally circulating capital. It is shaped by the macro time, but also about ideas of future and aspirations, whether or not they are concretized. So the first temporality, like I said, is the rhythmic, seasonal, and like pastoralism, intricately tied to weather patterns and the environment. As winter arrives in Bharmour, especially after the first snowfall, a significant chunk of the residents of Bharmour begin to make their way across the Dhauladhars. As Mukesh, again, who we have encountered earlier, said, even those who remain in Bharmour have little to do but wait out the winters, gathered around their tandoor exchanging stories. It is as if space and time are sort of decompressed in the winters before they speed up once again with spring. The result of this seasonality is that town life enters a slower, relaxed routine in the winters. While RCC, of course, is a much faster means of building than traditional wooden structures, which involve, often specialized painstaking work. Even with resources in hand, it is difficult to build around seasonal rhythms. As one couple with both husband and wife retired from government employment, so they had the money saved up at one go, told us, they said, no one is around in the winters in Bharmour. And in the summers, there is a shortage of workers and masons. So it takes very long to build here. We started our house, the building in 1998, then the second floor 2 years later, then the other floors after that. We finished only in 2005. From the perspective of capital, speeding up the process of construction shortens the turnover for the contractor and the labor. And yet fast construction is materially fraught, especially in such climatic zones. One a cement wholesaler told us that because the snow sits on structures for a long time, it sort of eats up the slab. Yakub, a mason from Chamba, working in, especially if you don't finish the construction, have roofing. Yakub, a mason from Chamba, working in Bharmour, says it. Hence, he says, people want work done quickly here, but when you work fast, the job is not that good. For example, if I chug my tea down right now, I will burn myself. But if I do it slowly, I enjoy it. He says, maza aega. The most common temporality of building in Bharmour proceeds incrementally. This logic of infrastructural configuration, that is this, the third one here. This logic of configurating infrastructures is, of course, well trodden in critical urban studies and infrastructure literature. And in fact, may be considered the prime mode by which things get built in the global south. Dhire-dhire, jod kar. Financial constraints, litigations, people's resistance ensure that even government projects, which otherwise work with a certain linearity, which is also codified in the whole discipline of project management, is in fact, disruption is the norm. To be sure, not all construction is sadly incremental. Those with the requisite capital may try to build at one go smoothly, that is, but even they have to adjust for the seasonal patterns. It is the buildings of those with limited access to savings that display the clearest rhythm of incrementalism. When we ask people about construction of their houses or shops, we mostly heard stories about it taking years, about building piece by piece, and about the struggles to save enough to build a home one aspires to. As one interlocutor asserted, it is impossible to estimate the time it takes to build, he says. We built as we save money. If I had money now, this house would be finished in no time. Another interlocutor, retired as a lineman from Indian Railways in Pathankot, told us how the family assembled the materials painstakingly from different places. Wood they got from Jasur, other materials, some material from Chamba town. At some point, they just simply ran out of money to build without completing roofing and fixtures. There are several such buildings around Bharmour which exist in suspension, etching into the ground the idea, as Akhil Gupta says, that completion is not the only possible outcome once a project begins. Such projects can be suspended for short periods or forever. In their study of concrete in Sikkim, Duncan McDuera and Mona Chetri see this cluster of steel rods protruding up or out from parts of completed dwellings as images of optimism and aspiration. In Bharmour, it seemed to us that these same elements were reminders of the personal struggles and sacrifices, of learning lessons from others and their own experiences, and deploying resources assembled from near and far. Furthermore, those building on tight budgets cut various corners to save costs and end up with significantly weaker structures, a pressing concern for a geologically active region like West Himalaya. We were told, how, and since many of you are architects, you would know that instead of 16 mm steel rod that a taller building would require, often costs would be cut by using 10 rods alongside cheaper cements, which is less likely to withstand the cold winters in Bharmour. And in this way, class, or the ability to pay here, is concretized into the fragile landscape, producing an uneven geography of risk. The greater inflow of cash due to employment within and outside the region, horticulture, and increased commercial opportunities have transformed Bharmour in so many ways. The rapid pace of change draws different emotional and material responses. Residents seek to position themselves depending on their reading of the future and to give them the best chance of surviving or thriving. Whether the future is an external force one must prepare for or a set of opportunities one can aspire to are related to experiences of the recent past. So very quickly, let me finish. That many trace the recent changes in their own lives and in Bharmour and project the trajectories forward in a somewhat linear manner to a future with even greater prosperity. But there are anxieties about densities, about the difficulties in accessing services, about the changing demographics, and about environmental consequences of such settlements. At the intimate scale, concrete construction is associated with several health concerns because of the walls and aspirational marble floors that do not regulate temperatures well. People spoke about getting asthma from inhaling the smoke since they have to sit by fire through the cold days and nights, while bemoaning the difficulties in constructing with wood anymore. There's a whole economics of this, why people who are sitting in between forests are unable to build with wood any longer. Others felt with increasing population, the existing infrastructures will be overstretched. There is part of the settlement has connected sewage, but most of it does not. It's not even classified as a town, which is why no planning or building codes exist, and it is outside the Town and Country Planning Act of the state. Even the slightly crooked Mani Mahesh temple in the Churasi complex, which you would have seen that image earlier when I was talking about historical time, is a reminder of the devastating Kangra earthquake of 1905, which leveled the entire region, just as the Nepal earthquake of 2015 is a strong portent of a looming catastrophe, which the new infrastructures may not survive for many. So considering some of these concerns around the time in the urban debate, most particularly from Bharmour, I would argue it demands attention to history, to the entrenched structures that shape time, and even to the context-specific things that mold time in their image. They also demand that our notions of the future do not lose sight of the qualities of wisdom and resourcefulness. I didn't get a lot of time to get into this, but this is also something that I've been working with. Wisdom and resourcefulness in the time of fashionable, quote unquote, smart characteristics of agility and hyperconnectedness that seem to really engulf us at the moment. So I'm done with the paper. I'll just leave you with this image that Kartikeya, who was the RA on the project, clicked in one home, where you can see in the midst of this kitchen, there is, I just love this image of a sheep sort of reminding or always present pastoralist time in people's life, even if they move to other pastures. Okay, thanks so much again, everyone. Just to acknowledge, former students who've been working with me on this project for these many years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll now open it for discussion. Before that, we have IAS Abhijit Kaplish here, DC Abohar and ADC Fazilka. I'll request him to share his views on the topic.
Hi. So it was a lovely talk. I really enjoyed myself, and the region has always fascinated me, the Himalayas, particularly from this point of view, from the point of view of this modernization. And I mean, of course, there are many ways to look at it, but I think today's talk, what really stood out was the nuance and the theoretical sort of groundedness that you brought in. I think that's very there, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Abhijit. I've heard of the good work you're doing in Abohar.
Thank you. In fact, yeah,
more
we had a
about
lovely time with Yogesh also. So I think Ambedkar University and Abohar have something to sort of connect on.
it. True.
Okay, so let's now open it for questions. People, please feel free to raise hands for the questions.
Hi, Rohit. Thank you so much for the talk. I just wanted to sort of, for the extending the infrastructural time, developmental time, which you sort of spoke about, and the scale factor of it. I wanted to ask you, you also mentioned that there's not much of public infrastructure in the Bharmour. There's less sewage network there. But how that plays out in this time, because in many ways, those infrastructure are also at a micro level, and also they play at a micro level as well. So how the materiality of those play out in the town? Thank you.
Should I just take up this or?
Yeah.
Okay. So no, that's a very good point, that it is cross-cutting, and there are ways in which, of course, the developmental project comes with a series of infrastructures, and primary amongst them are the ones that I mentioned already. That is, roads are the most important one in Himachal. They are considered, I mean, they sort of seep into also people's consciousness. Everyone wants a road. Then there is education, schools, healthcare, and agricultural extension as well. I would add to this. I haven't mentioned it here, but it is very important to the whole project of development, and all of it is tied to this notion of, like Abhijit mentioned, modernization. That is, we have to get people who are backward to a forward time, to where we are. So it's a sort of temporal movement that is imagined. But interestingly enough, that movement is not imagined spatially so much. So where are you going to be when there is change? Where is that change, or what is that change going to do to places that you are in already? Both those things happen. People move, and also places change as a result of these, both capitalism as well as state development projects. And that is where some of these concerns of what is the urban, what isn't, and the kinds of questions we are asking come in. Now, obviously, because the spatiality is not so critical to these projects, the whole notion of collective consumption or collective infrastructures that we otherwise would talk about in a certain density, like, and it's not only sanitation or sewage, but it's also public spaces, but it's also pathways of movement, and all of these, they are not really part of that combination or the box of infrastructure or developmental projects. And certainly building codes are they're not even in the horizon. So therefore people have to do those things themselves. So how do you do that? It's through septic tanks. It is through collective septic tanks also. Some families coming together and building a joint common septic tank. And septic tanks obviously come with their own series of issues, that we don't have to get into, but they are there. Public spaces, where is the collective life going to unfold? So I haven't observed this in Bharmour, but in another town, another place that we've been studying, where Banjar in Kullu district, just recently when I was there, there was a marriage function which took place on sort of an unfinished building, on the slab, on the roof of an unfinished building. Those are your public spaces. How are people going to move between different places and from the road out to wherever they're building? Again, it's shared. It's like people enter into negotiations with each other. You will leave some pathway for the other person, but also you may not. If especially it's an absentee landlord situation, someone who doesn't live there anymore, they don't really care about social networks or the social contact so much, right? And then you have these, again, this we detailed in the other project, that you have buildings which have to be abandoned because there is no way you can reach them anymore. Because once there was a path there, but now that there is construction everywhere, they just sort of are inaccessible to the owners completely. So there is this lacuna then between how development project functions, how it does not imagine speciality. Meanwhile, how land and property dynamics come in and they lead to this kind of a construction, and then those questions that emerge. But yeah, there can be more that we can discuss. I don't want to just go on and on.
Kanchan wants to ask a question.
Yeah. Hi, Rohit. I was just intrigued about this usage of concrete. It makes the whole landscape look quite ugly, actually. What about like conservation of traditional materials? And is there any awareness, or are there any groups working to conserve the traditional ways of construction in the hills in your particular case?
I mean, there are elsewhere. Actually, I see Kartikeya is here. You can come in also, Kartikeya, if you have anything to add to this. Not in Bharmour, but definitely in other places there are people who are trying to see what can be done about it, because it's not only about the aesthetic of it. It is also about the sort of dwelling in them, especially in this kind of climate that I briefly mentioned, that are completely very, very ill suited for the winters. And then, of course, it is about skill and about craft and about certain kinds of knowledges of building and construction that are obsolete, that are increasingly becoming obsolete in such places. And so we are sort of may lose those knowledges also alongside the change in construction, as skills then are different kinds of skills are required now. So all of these are happening simultaneously. So there are, of course, the Palampur experiments and the contractor and them. And there are others, some architects elsewhere also in Shimla and other places who are looking to somehow work with the wood and stone construction. But in terms of scaling, in terms of larger scales, it's, at least right now, you don't see it very much. And it is also very difficult to imagine that there'll be a large scale change. In terms of economics, it's just too expensive. Like getting hold of timber is very expensive. And there is very strict regulation of, TD rights. That is, you could get in a certain number of years, you could get right to basically get sleepers from a tree, cut down a tree if you're a local to build. But there have been a lot of politics around that. It's also gone to court. Meanwhile, and this is the irony, which is that while locals are building with concrete, the really upmarket hotels and resorts are the ones which have all the wood. And so there is a shadow economy of all of that. Of course, there is smuggling of timber and illegal felling, which is also happening. So there is this situation which one sees. And, I don't want to name folks here, but because this might be public, but there are well-known politicians on Himachal who everyone knows have made money through illegal felling of wood and timber, and even though their own villagers are building these kinds of construction, this concrete sort of construction. So that's how it is. It's environmentally, it's an issue. Structurally, I mean, geologically, it's an issue. Obviously, aesthetically, it is an issue. And yet it is also seen as the future in a sense. So if that sort of wooden housing was our past, then this is how our future is. And this is how our future should be. So building a concrete home is sort of is a sign of that you've made it in life, right? Being able to provide a floor for each son. It's a patriarchal society fully. So providing a floor for a son, a separate floor for each son, that is still considered for people getting on in the years as something that they aspire to, and that is sort of their duty to their children. So it's mixed up in all of these things. I mean, I'm sure I know one person who's doing this kind of ethnographic work with concrete, but it is definitely required. Yeah, more of it is required.
Thanks. Very informative.
Hi, Rohit. Thank you for that talk. A lot of it, you know, I mean, there are lots of things that you brought up today that were very, you know, like as an architecture student or like as a researcher who's come from the architecture background, you come across, but it's hard to articulate some of the things that you mentioned today, like the concept of seasonal time or you know, or this developmental time, or so of course incrementality and things like that are things that we've been looking at, especially after IHS, you know, that comes into your vocabulary. And yet these different speeds that you kind of brought up today was, you know, very, very interesting to think about how cities come up or how urbanization happens. And even though it's coming from the study of this place which is not even a census town yet, you know, so that I think was very very interesting for me. I think what I wanted to bring up was that in Abohar, you know, every time we travel to Abohar, there's a different crop growing. You know, even like we cross almost like a lot of Punjab and the fields and everything, you see everything that's changing in the landscape. And then you finally reach Abohar, and because we spend time in Abohar, we see how, you know, the mandi has completely transformed. There'll be wheat one time, there'll be cotton another time, there'll be kinus another time. And how, you know, we've been noticing how like there is a relationship with the city, but maybe it is also shifting out, like the mandi has shifted out from the center of the city. And now, and like in the sort of outside the city, you see it. Maybe the labor is definitely involved, because where they get their jobs during that time would probably depend on the season. And yet, like as people who are intervening, trying to figure out, you know, what our project should be about, it's almost like it has nothing to do with, you know, this landscape we're designing or the what interventions we're doing, or like the, you know, the kind of questions we're even asking residents. Or so yeah, it was just sort of a reflection while you were talking on seasonality that kind of came up for me.
Right.
Another thing that I was thinking about was that, especially in terms of, like, I'm not sure, maybe I missed it, but like the linear was that the state time or the
yeah, I was talking about development. Yes, go ahead.
Right. No, so this was a question we were kind of engaging with even in Bombay, when we were wondering that, you know, like our larger projects, like especially in Bombay, like for example, even the state projects keep getting you know, stalled, or we're wondering if there is incrementality at a different scale in at that scale. And of course, the topography in which you work would probably be of a different, I mean, more so maybe. Or so I was just wondering, like, I'm not sure if the linear smooth were you also talking about this in that conversation, or I kind of maybe missed it. I just was wondering if you'd say more about how you see it.
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about how even the linear time is sort of bends around first seasonality. And because, so interestingly enough, even the state development and sort of state time is also in places like Bharmour, but not only Bharmour in Himachal, there is also Pangi in Chamba, Spiti and Laul, Kinnaur, parts of Kinnaur, where you have similar situation, where even the time of the state is sort of adapts to the season. So for the whole paraphernalia and functioning of the state changes during that time. In fact, recently, I gave, while coming back from Himachal, I gave a lift to a policeman, and he had and he was talking about many things. But, one of those things was how it is. Yeah, it's like कोई crime कुछ नहीं होता है, आराम से salary जेब में मिल जाती है, 4 महीने 5 महीने की, आराम से बैठते हैं, right? So that whole, even the state time, first of all, is sort of adapts to seasonality. That's one. Capitalism is trying to, this whole new push towards highways and hyper sort of connectedness is changing that. Definitely, the Laul tunnel, for instance, sort of changes that in a different place. Internet digital is changing that. That's is something that perhaps is to be asked, to be thought about more. But also, I did mention how even the time, obviously, like you rightly said, it imagines itself as smooth, but it is anything but that. There are so many things from material issues. For instance, the tunnel, the new Manali to Kiratpur highway, the tunnel has caved in so many times that the project should have been completed in 3 years after 2012. It is 9 years and still has a long way to go. So there is that, the material side. Then there is the resistance by people and so on. This is also true of that 4-lane, people resisting and not protesting, don't want to give their land for that. You can see that also with the new airport in Himachal, by the way, which the chief minister is pushing, but it makes zero sense. And people are it also. And then, so there is the material, there is people, and that then leads to sometimes, for instance, Niti Aayog few months ago said that there is too much democracy in India, right? Then they get there are these ideas about how, the linearity. So when I developmental time, mean that is really are. Imagining this is kind of temporal riser they work with, but obviously it's not. In fact, it's not smooth. So changes and varies and so on.
Do anybody have more questions? I'll ask a quick question. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, sir, like you mentioned about the Gaddi community in Bharmour. So we have cities having community which is like isolated from the rest of the society and confined to a space. So how difficult is to like administer such small cities to empower such communities? Like it is just like just declaring them backward class to introduce to them to some government policies is enough to tackle. Like any more alternatives?
So there are many things here. First, that like I was saying that this, Gaddi, one could make this argument about others also, which you can. So I'll just talk about the Gaddi community, which is that it is a very strange or somewhat strange, incongruous, I should put it this way, that a group which has such wide connections and which travels and which sort of through social networks, through even material networks, economic networks, has such a wide, expansive space of living, is characterized in social imagination, state imagination as isolated and backward, first of all. So that itself is a question as to where has that come from. That has obviously come from this older notions of what a tribe is. ट्राइब का एसेंशियल आइडियाज हैं, वो बड़े अभी तक भी बड़े स्ट्रॉन्ग अमीन हैं, है ना. अभी तक लोग गद्दी समझ के एक तरीके से समझते हैं, लेकिन द रियलिटी इज वेरी डिफरेंट. सेकेंडली, सो वो ऑलरेडी पहले से है. सेकेंडली, pastoralists, this is something that maybe someone here who's from the pastoralist sort of studies tradition might also speak about, but pastoralists do not, even though they look like they are poor, but they are not really. They always have wealth in animals. They're always moving with their wealth. And so it's neither a case of being that kind of fully isolated, nor the case of being even super poor. And yet, when these opportunities present themselves of, reservation as tribal, of road or other development, of a college that will open up in Bharmour, yes, please, we are isolated and tribal, and poor. So it's also performative, and people are playing on that. There is these ideas that are very strong, and the locals are happy to go along with these ideas and benefit from the material side of things. In general, to what you're asking, I think the issue is about autonomy, whether you have the space, the capacity to agency to make decisions about what your locality should look like, the pace, the speed at which it should change, and the way it should change. That is the key question, because that's not available, that those choice options are not available to a lot of people, right? I was recently giving a similar talk with a group, with Naga Scholars Association. So, and it was very interesting to talk to them, scholars often from Nagaland, and where this autonomy is is not there for various reasons, militarization, also resources that many outsiders and state has sort of come in for, and they just have to sort of do what is best, but the agenda is decided from elsewhere. So that's the key question, I think, whether you have the agency to set the time and the kind of vision for your place or not.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so do we have more questions? So if not, sir, thank you for the talk, sir. Thank you so much. It was very interesting to hear you.
Kanchan has asked something on chat. Yes, it is. It is a village, very much a village. I mean, officially, yes. But like I'm saying, in terms of the built environment, in terms of density, in terms of the need for collective thinking, which you don't necessarily need in the village, in quote unquote the sort of spatial idea of a village, but in this kind of a settlement, you now need to think about those things like public access, about utilities, about such things. what happens usually in Himachal is that first of all, the census categories don't matter so much because you will never reach them, because those are like 5,000 ka Himachal mein matlab hai, already it's a big town. So wo to zarurat nahi hai, but what is the notify kar dete hain Nagar Panchayat. Usually they notify the settlement as Nagar Panchayat, and then the few years later the Town and Country Planning Act and all of those things come in. But while that happens, the place has already changed. So we see that with Banjar actually, with that it is now a Nagar Panchayat. It's been a Nagar Panchayat for last several years, but there is a significant lag between things already changing on the ground and then the whole government sort of planning structures coming in. And so what are you going to do with everything that has been built? Everything that is already there. So perhaps what is needed is definitely to think about these spaces which are changing in this way in terms of built environment and infrastructures, but are not characterized as urban, Nagar Panchayat even. So, and there are like plenty, just in Kullu district, when I counted, there were some 8, 10, 12 such places. And obviously there are many more in other districts.
Thanks, Rohit.
Do we have more questions? Okay, so sir, let's call it a day. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the talk.